Hey everyone, this is Kevin Rabichow. Just want to thank you for submitting your questions for this Q&A. I've copied them over to this slideshow here and I'll go through them one at a time. I believe if you submitted a question, it will be on here. I made a few edits because I got a few questions that were quite similar to each other, so I tried to combine them, but I hope that I'm addressing everything that you all asked for. So the first thing here, with how much content that's available now, how does this course differ to make it worth considering? That's a great consideration that I was making when producing this content. The difference in this course is that my focus is on making sure that the viewer gets applicable feedback on whatever it is their personal situation is with poker. So I'm not presenting a generic set of information to teach you all the things that you need to know about one game. Instead, I'm guiding you through the process that I go through myself and I go through with my students to figure out where you're at, to set targets or set goals for yourself in improvement, and then gather all of the necessary skills or all of the necessary information to make that shift happen in your game. So I think the big difference here from this course and a lot of other ones on the market is that I'm trying to bridge that gap towards private coaching where you are personally getting what you need out of this course rather than you're getting what I'm giving in this course. So that brings me to the next question. Who is this course for? Cash, tournament, live, online, what stakes? The level of discussion is typical for the content that I've made on Run It Once. So if you're familiar with my Run It Once content, or if you've seen me in the past on stream or doing commentary or whatnot, that's going to be my level of discussion throughout the course. So I do think that caters to an audience who is quite familiar with the game and with strategy, but this doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a live or an online player. It doesn't mean you have to be a cash game or a tournament player. It doesn't even mean you need to play high stakes. It just means you need to be kind of familiar with the language, with the tools, and a lot of that stuff I do actually break down in more detail than I normally would in a video because this course is so process oriented. So I think this is really, if you're even considering my content, if you're a fan of my previous content, or if you're familiar with the type of stuff that I normally talk about, then I think this is absolutely at your level. How long do you spend working on a specific weakness? I like this question because it's the type of content that I really get into in this course. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for this, but I think it would be less time than you expect, right? So when I break down a weakness, I'm thinking about first picking it apart so that it is achievable in a reasonable period of time. So when I think of a weakness, I'm not thinking about, I'm too passive, or I just play, I'm too much of a station. I call too much. This is too broad. This isn't a specific weakness. When I think of a weakness, and this will be made clear in the course, I'm thinking of, I didn't realize I was too aggressive on the turn-in position. Or, I'm really trying to get better at bluff catching when my opponent checks behind the turn, right? We're adding more specificity so that the problem is smaller, and it really shouldn't take that long for you to work through it. If you're using the methods that I recommend in this course, we're talking about addressing weaknesses over the scale of weeks, not months or years. Some of the biggest obstacles that keep low stakes players from getting better, I think. Of course, the term low stakes is kind of broad, but if I'm imagining a consistent, dedicated player who's just having a hard time getting better, I think one of the biggest obstacles is blind spots, right? You really don't know what you don't know. So a lot of people learn in their closed off environment, or they work on their game in their closed off environment, and they have a hard time seeing what differentiates them from the really good players, or even from the mid stakes players or the high stakes players, right? So it's going to be different for everyone. I could give you a generic answer like you probably fold too much, or maybe you don't bluff enough, and that might be true. It often is, but I think if we're speaking to the real problem here, it's just not getting enough outside feedback. It's not getting fresh eyes on the problem. It's not hearing different perspectives. So hopefully that's something that I address through this course, both through the content and also by providing a Discord community where people can interact and work on these problems together. How do I approach keeping track of live hands or live stats? This is an ongoing challenge for me since I've switched to live. If you don't know much about my career, I've been playing live for the past 3 years or so as my main game. I played the previous decade or maybe 12 years before that online. And I haven't found a system that's perfect for this. I've moved away a little bit from thinking in terms of stats when I try to approach what I'm accomplishing live. Although it is sort of what's happening in the back of my mind when I think about, what are the opportunities to exploit these players? What are they doing poorly? I'm of course thinking in numbers, but I don't track it the same way that I track online with tools that collect data for us. I do think you could do this with spreadsheets, but it's kind of distracting. My preference now is just to write as much stuff as possible that crosses your mind while you're playing. So to take note of all the hands, all the observations, all the data points that you collect, just have a notepad open and write that all down during your session. By writing it down, you flush it from your mind, you can keep playing. And then when you're done with your session, or maybe the next morning after you've woken up, before you go to your following session, go back to those notes and read through them and try to translate them into something a little more, of a quick summary, a little more applicable. And as you gather notes like that over weeks, over months, you'll start to find the commonalities that things you've noticed in a variety of players, things you've noticed about yourself in a variety of spots. And now you're building up kind of a database, just a more qualitative database of observations that you've made. When studying, do you recommend focusing on breadth or depth? So the way that I understand this question is basically the difference between going deeply into specific concepts and trying to learn them inside and out versus, being more of a generalist. I think that it depends on what format or what challenge you're taking on. Because I remember when I was playing Heads Up No Limit online, I was definitely focusing on depth, right? So the details mattered a lot because there wasn't that much to study. There weren't that many scenarios to study. I was always playing 100 big blinds. I was always playing heads up. That allowed me to get into some very specific details and actually remember them and actually make like heuristics for them. But for a lot of us who play, let's say, live cash or tournaments, the game is a little too complex to learn every single detail of every single spot. So in those situations, it's more important to go wide and get 80% of the information with 20% of the effort. That's kind of the approach that I take in this course. I'm more interested in getting the high value, like low hanging fruit in all of the situations. And I'm only going into depth when I feel confident that all the fundamental areas have been covered, even all of the intermediate areas have been covered. So that would be kind of the timeline, right? You want to go wide and make sure you understand everything that's important or fundamental before you go in depth into anything in particular. What is my system in hand reading? So I think that this is kind of a combination of all the skills that you develop as a player, all the intuition that you develop. But I would say that my process is pretty deeply rooted in theory and my understanding of how other players approach theory. So this is about hand reading against like a good player. My process might look something like evaluating the heuristics that they're likely to use. So maybe they always continuation bet the flop after they raise before the flop. And then I know their pre-flop range. So I can give them, a very wide range of hands that continuation bets the flop. And then I can match that up with theory and think, okay, well, that's not appropriate in this spot. I know that because I studied the solution. So the counter for that type of heuristic is to do this. And that can carry over to turns or rivers, right? Like, people tend to bluff with draws on the turn. They tend to bluff with equity. So how does that map to this situation? Are there a lot of equity hands on this board? Are there not so many equity hands on this board? So it's a little bit of psychology, understanding how people approach the game, and it's a little bit of theory to understand if that's appropriate for the situation. Hopefully that it's a pretty big question. So hopefully that describes the basics of it. I use stretch goals in my study. I mean, the way that I think about study is usually on a short time horizon. So I guess for me personally, I don't really do this. They are certainly, I think, for someone who's, let's say, at low stakes and their stretch goal is to make it to high stakes. I think they're a really powerful motivator. So I actually think that for a lot of players, stretch goals are quite important. And having this on the horizon gives you the motivation that you might need to put in the effort, 1 month at a time, 3 months at a time, to make those incremental changes from micro to low to mid to high stakes. At the same time, you don't want to be in that situation where you're a bit of a dreamer and you kind of sit back on the sideline. You watch, the high roller players, you watch the high stake streams, and you just think about how you could play in that game. But in reality, you're not putting in those incremental efforts. So there is a balance to find there. I think stretch goals are good as a motivator, as like the prize at the end of the path. But you're also going to want a lot of short-term goals, a lot of achievable goals, and you want to make those steps throughout the whole process, right? And those steps are not going to end. Even like I said, for me, that's what I do almost exclusively now. There's not really a stretch goal on the horizon right now, but continuous improvement is for me a necessity, even at the highest stakes. Will the course have any live poker concepts or exploit info? Yes and no. There will be the entire course is designed in a way where the concepts that I'm teaching will cross over to live poker, or will cross over to different formats than Heads Up No Limit. The exploitative info, I'm assuming you're asking more like specific advice for how to take advantage of live poker, how to take advantage of players in live poker. That's not the type of content that's in this course. So while I do teach the concept of, here's the information that you have available, here's the exploitative concept that you might be trying to accomplish, and how can you turn that into a strategy? How can you turn that into a game plan? That's exactly what I'm presenting in this course, and that would definitely apply to live poker. A lot of my approach is exploitative in nature, but it isn't the type of course that lays out a set of exploitative ideas or strategic points to just go and adopt in the games that you're playing. So will I provide simplified strategies or an approach to game plan that can be applied in live games? So I guess this I kind of answered in the previous question. The approach to a game plan, yes, that's exactly what I'm providing. So the framework is there, the methods are there, and a lot of my students have used this to be successful in live games. That said, will I provide simplified strategies? The only simplified strategies that are provided explicitly in the course are Heads Up No Limit strategies. So those were the building block for the game planning design, and that was the game that I solved to prepare for the Legend Showdown and prepare for my own games in the past. So the output, like the solutions that are provided in the course, are going to be Heads Up No Limit, not for live games. But the approach, the game planning process, can absolutely be applied to live games. This person says this game is too complex. Once you spend enough time in front of the solver, how would you study with solvers and not get lost? What would you pay attention to and what not? This is great. This is the emphasis of the entire improvement section of the course, where there's my review of how to use PO Solver, how to use a web solver, or how to use a preflop solver, right? The entire challenge is figuring out how much of this stuff matters. And it took me years to get better at that. I don't think this is an easy thing. I try to get across as much information on this topic as possible in this course, but separating the essential information from the noise is not an obvious thing that I can, transfer to the viewer in just a few minutes. I think that it's going to take experience for you to understand. Sometimes when there's, a low frequency of a play, it's important. And other times when there's a low frequency of a play, it's not important. Sometimes the blocker effects matter. Sometimes the blocker effects don't matter. This is difficult. But I think if you follow the material in the course, you're going to pick up on the common focus points for me when I'm going into a solver. I'm trying to take away what's the strategy I can replicate. What are the driving forces behind the parameters, the setup of this solution that led to the output that we're looking at. It's paying attention. It's knowing before you open the solve. It's knowing before you open a preflop chart. What am I trying to take away from this before you go in? And that way, it's a lot easier not to get sucked into that rabbit hole, right? If you're not sure what you're looking for in the first place, then you're going to search and search and search, and you're going to find everything. But a lot of it is noise, unfortunately. So I do think that paying attention, going in with a question is going to help break this down most effectively. Asking before you open the solution, what am I trying to learn from looking at this, single raise pot in position? Am I trying to learn the blocker effects, or am I just trying to learn the worst value hand? Am I trying to learn, the difference between hearts and spades on this turn card, or am I just trying to figure out what are the bluffs that I'm missing that I need to find? I think simplifying those questions, trying to strip away the complexity, happens before you sit down and look at the solver. How do you combine studying GTO with playing exploitative strategies? I think there were a few different versions of this question. The game plan is exactly about this. It's my opinion that we should study theory and we should play exploitative. So studying theory includes studying how to exploit people. GTO theory includes exploitative play. A solver, given restrictions, will maximally exploit its opponent. So when I study GTO, I'm not only studying what the equilibrium strategy is, the end result that you see in the solution, but I'm also studying what did it take to get here? What kind of assumptions are we making for both ranges that led to the equilibrium that we're looking at right now? And what might change that, right? If we took away some of the bluffs, if we added too many thin value bets, if we changed the bet sizing, what might change? I think this is inherent in the way that I study GTO, and I think that comes across clearly in the course and in my other content. So to me, it's not at odds with each other, right? It doesn't conflict in any way. Playing exploitative strategies just means when you're at the table, when you're facing a big river bet, you're not mulling over, oh gosh, is this a GTO call? You're just thinking, am I getting the right price? Are they bluffing enough? Right? Playing exploitative strategies is a mindset thing. It's a practical execution thing, and thought process and all of that are completely separate from the stuff that we learn when we look at solutions. And I think that my opinion on this comes clearly across with the way that I've designed the course, separating theoretical study from practical training. And yeah, I forgot that this question was coming up next. So will the course address strategies for improving in-game execution? Absolutely. Yes. There's quite a bit of detail on this. There's a number of videos where I'm working on my own in-game execution by using the trainer and talking through my process there. And I also break down the approach that I use with the different pieces of software that do this type of thing. What advice would I give to people before diving into the course? I think that you're going to want to set aside enough time and set aside enough effort to be able to go through, because this is an interactive course. You're going to want to be willing to print out some pages, to open up these Google Forms or whatever format it is that you're doing the evaluation in, and really be open and willing to changing the way that you play or changing the way that you study. You're going to get some good tips and tricks from this course, even if you don't go through the evaluation, but you're really going to get the true benefit of this course if you're prepared to take stock of what your game looks like right now and seriously consider what it is that you want to change about your game. That's going to take, a few days, right? That's going to take some dedicated effort to reflect on your game, to reflect on your processes, to think about what's most important. And I walk through exactly how to do this. I'm sure any of you listening to this can absolutely do what I'm talking about. But really, it's just about giving yourself the space and the time to do that. Other than that, I think the material is pretty self-explanatory. All of the videos, I introduce exactly why you're there, what the concepts are, and what it is that you're supposed to be taking away. What are the most important 6max stats, and what are the perfect numbers for those stats? This is an interesting question. I actually do include in the course a number of heads-up stats and what you might be calling the perfect numbers for heads up stats. So I do have a good deal of PO Solver generated data that I extracted from running a whole bunch of solutions, a whole bunch of scripts in PO Solver to figure out, how a GTO robot would play heads up no limit. And I compare that to myself. So I compare myself against that metric. I do think that this is a really valuable way of studying. At the same time, I don't think, you should be striving for the perfect number on all of your stats. There are certain areas of the game where your opponents are going to play pretty well. And in those areas, you're going to want to play really well in response. You might say you might want to follow the GTO frequencies, but in a lot of areas, and for most of you watching this, your opponents don't play that way, and that means that you shouldn't be, striving for perfect numbers. You should be striving for an understanding of what it is that you want to accomplish against those players. This is what game planning is all about. You want to evaluate who your opponents are, what they're doing well, what they're doing poorly, and then evaluate yourself, what you're doing well, what you're doing poorly, and find the best way to align those things, right? Find the best approach for you, and then study all the things that you're not successful at in the meantime. So, a lot of this stuff, like what your flop check raise is, what your 3-bet frequencies are by position. I mean, these are important. They're fundamental. And anything that I've labeled fundamental in the evaluation is what I would say are the most important stats. They're the most frequent. They're the most impactful on your win rate for that reason. So anything I mark fundamental in the evaluation, those are what I consider the most important. It's all the pre-flop stuff, all the flop stuff, early street frequent scenarios would be my answer for that. But again, not necessarily striving for perfect numbers, just striving for a well-designed game plan. How would you study and build a bankroll from microstakes? So I believe that building a bankroll, this is something that I haven't done in a long time. So the way that I went about this when I was learning the game is not going to be the way that you're going to want to go about this now. I think there's a number of content creators and higher stakes players who have gone through bankroll challenges or whatever version of that, $1 to 1,000 or $10 to 10,000 kind of things. And I think the process is pretty straightforward. Like, be responsible with that money, treat it as if it's all the money that you have, and then gradually work your way through the limits, through the available games that you have for you, until that bankroll is more, sustainable, until that bankroll is able to handle bigger swings and higher stakes. And I would scale my study in the same way. So if the only game that I can play is the $2 buy-in, the $5 buy-in, then I'm not going to be spending hundreds of dollars a month on expensive study tools, right? Because that's just going to suck the money right out of your bankroll. You're going to need to focus on playing. You're going to need to focus on volume if that's where you're starting from. And those expensive study methods, those premium products, really only need to happen once you're playing big games, once you're playing really tough competition, and once that standard of play has risen to the point where you can't get away with, free articles or YouTube videos or, $20 books. The type of information that you can get for free or for very cheap is going to do great for microstakes. So I think trying to go beyond that would be a mistake. So I think my biggest piece of advice here is just study at the level that you're playing, and don't try and jump ahead, and don't use too much of your finances on study when you can't afford to. You're going to have that cushion once you get to higher stakes, and maybe you can invest in yourself at that point once you get to higher stakes in those more advanced study methods to keep you progressing forward.